Good morning, Daniel.
Morning, Dan.
What are we talking about today?
Today we're going to be discussing pushing families to spend more, the concept of tipping, and price versus value.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, spending more, spending on things you've already spent money on, and price versus value should be an interesting roundup. So hit me. Talk to me about pushing families to spend more.
I think it's a unique problem. It's definitely not the norm we see with families. However, it is something we run into. Some individuals and families simply have goals and aspirations and need a certain sum of money to achieve those goals and simply save more. Whether it's greed or fear or maybe a mixture of both. I thought it was a really good topic to talk about here today. So first and foremost, to start it off, Dan, what does oversaving actually look like? And, how do you know it when you see it from a client's standpoint?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what it looks like from personal experience because I oversave today from a financial plan standpoint. Uh, in terms of how that really shows up in real life, it is maximizing your opportunities to save, particularly on like a retirement tax efficient basis, at the expense of your present life and in a manner that is not conducive towards kind of saving an adequate amount, but saving literally too much. So, some really direct diagnoses for some folks are people with a level of income or a level of lifestyle expense that doesn't require that they do something like max out their 401k, who are doing it anyway. And in that context, you have to be a little bit careful because some people should be saving more or are not saving enough. Some people need to play catch up. But to give you just sort of a made up example, it's somebody who is earning, let's say, $75,000 a year, who is putting $23,000 into their 401k and is also max funding a Roth IRA. Right. So somebody who's saving essentially $30,000 a year, almost 50% of their income. Now, you can get into things like the FIRE movement, where that's the whole goal. But from a fundamental standpoint, what that type of saving behavior is likely to produce is ideally financial independence early. But if that's not your actual objective, if you're just saving for saving's sake and you have no intention of quitting your career early or stopping work early, then that's going to result in a world where you have essentially more money than you know what to do with later in life. And we can all think of creative ways to like light money on fire, but in a general sense, right, we're putting so much money away that we're foregoing the quality of life today or foregoing a more reasonable quality of life considering our means.
Interesting. Yeah, it's definitely not the norm, but it is something we see, and a lot of people. I think a really good thing you said there was, you are maximizing the savings at the expense of today. But for a lot of these families, they might not need to. They're already saving an adequate sum and have the opportunity to start spending more. So let's say we we had a client that we were trying to motivate to start spending more. How do you engage that conversation, and what are some of the potential opportunities or levers you might present to them as chances to start using that money more effectively?
Sure. So, assuming that somebody is genuinely oversaving, the core question here, or sorry, let me back that out. Whether they're oversaving while they're still working in the accumulation phase without any particular goal that warrants it, i.e., I just want to retire as soon as possible, or conversely, somebody who is already in retirement who is underspending, there's really sort of two baselines for that. For the person who's working today and who's oversaving today, I always want to be cautious about telling somebody, "Hey, just you should go spend more money," because that sometimes can come around and backfire on us. But often I'm going to look for sort of where are the friction points in their lifestyle. A lot of times, people who are doing this are suffering from other anxieties or stresses. So, for example, they talk about not having a lot of free time, or they talk about feeling stressed about how much money they're saving for their kids' college and their retirement, and trying to be responsible, or they're overworked. They're talking about not taking enough trips or vacations or that sort of thing, or they have a physical ailment and they're not spending. A lot of times, somebody who's oversaving to such a degree that it warrants a conversation is somebody who's really exhibiting a big element of either what's called a money focus money script or a money vigilance money script. And these are similar but different. Money focus really emphasizes just, hey, the accumulation of wealth for wealth's sake. This is a script you might see in somebody like a billionaire, right? Somebody who seems to have more money than they'll ever need and yet does not seem disinterested in making more money than they'll ever need. Money vigilance is just somebody who is very, very cautious and careful about how they deploy their money and their resources. They don't want to overspend. They tend to forego things. They buy clearance items and thrift items. They will buy close to expired or day old stuff. And on some level, I think a point of caution for people who are experiencing either of those scripts in how they need to think about addressing those things is just to remember that tomorrow is not promised, right? We're financial planners, so we always emphasize long-term planning and saving for retirement, building up wealth, and having enough to provide for yourself and so on. But every day somebody gets hit by a bus. Every day somebody gets a cancer diagnosis. Every day somebody suddenly has a heart attack. And so it's something to be important, something to kind of keep in mind is that the objective of saving money is good and building wealth is good, but we should not do it to such an extent that we run the risk of never enjoying the fruits of our labors, where we're not taking those trips, we're not having those unique experiences. So often as a financial planner, advice for this will be, hey, you could afford to take an extra vacation every year, or hey, you say you're really focused on your health, but you don't really spend a lot on groceries. I think you could maybe afford to buy some higher quality food or, clothing. Hey, you not to be too picky about fashion, right? But you're sort of wearing the same stuff year after year that I see you. Have you ever thought about getting yourself something else? And I've done this myself, right? I ran the same running shoes about 10 times longer than the recommended life. I wore my first set of kind of work and professional shoes for about 7 years too long, to the point that they literally had holes wearing through the soles. So I'm not unfamiliar with this, but there comes a point at which if you're saving that much and so much that you realistically you can afford to keep saving as much as you're saving, but also could probably afford to spend a little bit on yourself or on your family or on experiences or memories, or if you just don't feel comfortable spending on yourself, if you're a really ascetic type of person, give it away, donate it, put it to good use somewhere else. But all this to say, there's an element of preparing for the future and there's an element of enjoying the present.
I don't think I could have said it a lot better myself. I do also enjoy beating a nice pair of shoes into the ground, so I can understand that. I think for folks a little bit, later in life too, it's not just buying things; it's buying back your time. Time is the one thing we simply cannot take it back once it's already passed. However, you can buy your time back, whether it's, having somebody do grocery shopping for you or starting to delegate in certain tasks that your entire life you have taken the responsibility on. So many people that are a little later in life come to us and say, I just wish I had more time. It's not more money. It's not more prestige or fame. I want more time. So I think challenging families and folks to buy their time back is equally, if not more valuable than simply buying things or donating money.
Well, and in that particular context, question I often like to ask clients, what would financial success look like for you? If money wasn't the issue or the object, what's different in your life? And sometimes clients really struggle to articulate that. They just haven't gotten quite that far ahead in how they think about money and their personal life. So the example that I'll share with them is, look, I don't want to clean my own house. I don't want to fix anything in my own house. I don't want to have to build anything in my own house. There are people who do all of those things full time for a living. They're great at it. I'm bad at all of it. And so I would rather trade the money for the time, not only just for the time, but also for the sake of it being done right and by somebody who is genuinely good at it. And that's just one example. But that means, that translates to paying somebody to clean my home, paying somebody to garden or take care of the yard, paying somebody to, caulk the little cracks or change the filters in furnaces and so on. And for a lot of people, they kind of scoff and say, well, that's a waste of money. And it is to you. In what you value and what's important to you. But that's the sort of thing I encourage people to think about is, if money was not the sole object or the sole obstacle, what would we want our life to look like? And then when we think about whether we're saving adequately or oversaving, or whether we're spending adequately or underspending, let's just apply that logic. Hey, if money's not the problem here, what would I want to spend my money on? And that can be a really helpful frame to just improve the way that we're spending our money and to improve our day-to-day quality of life.
That's perfect. So this topic here, number two, might be a little bit of a ticking time bomb in some ways, as it's going to divide, I'm sure, a good amount of people. But it's this concept of tipping, Dan, and I'd say recently, a lot of my friends and family like to tell me it's gotten a little bit out of control. This tipping culture and who gets tipped, who doesn't get tipped. So I wanted to talk about it today. What are some of the general rules of thumb when it comes to tipping? Because it seems like more and more services are asking for gratuity these days.
So, this is an interesting subject because there's been a universal tip standard for quite a long time, and it's really only with the advent of kind of more consumer facing, customer facing point of sale systems. When it's what I mean by that is you go to the coffee shop and it's not sort of an analog cash register where they like typed in the price of your goods and then it kind of spit out a paper receipt and then they told you, hey, that'll be $4 or whatever. But in the advent of things like Square point of sales, where it's an iPad that sort of flips around to face you and you have to finger sign your name, and also it'll pop up and say, do you want to pay 15, 18, 20%? The advent of that type of technology and the research around behavioral nudges has started to move the needle on the tipping stuff. So I think it's interesting, and you know exactly where my benchmark for this is, but my benchmark on gratuities is 15%. And there are people out there who will say, I always tip 20%. Great, good for you. There's people say, I never tip less than 25, 30. Great, good for you. That's fine. But I find it interesting that has started to happen because that represents that nudging effect starting to creep into the social consciousness. It's a desire to avoid friction around a transaction that leads us to just go ahead and pick one of the options on the screen instead of hitting no tip or instead of hitting custom tip and taking extra time to type in the number. But until technology and sort of behavioral finance and financial psychology started to show that you could get people to tip significantly more just by reducing the friction, right? Making it more of an opt-out process than an opt-in process. The standard for gratuities pretty much universally was 15% for normal service, 20% for great service for restaurants and various places like that. And then you had, common sort of benchmark standards of, let's say, like $1 for a coffee or $1 for a drink at a bar. Maybe it was $1 to $5 for somebody who helps you with your bags when you take a shuttle or a bus or something like that. And they, at the airport, and they, pick your bag up and whatnot. So there's all these little kind of arbitrary rules that have been around for a long time, but we're starting to see a pretty aggressive expansion of those through the lens of behavioral finance and through financial technology that is fundamentally designed to kind of manipulate you or coerce you into giving bigger amounts of money.
I think you said something in there that I really liked. It was the desire to avoid friction when it comes to tipping, because that's so true. I see people when they turn that kiosk or that iPad around, they look around, see if anybody's looking because they don't want people to judge what they're tipping. I should have asked this question first, but I do think it's important because people do it blindly, this desire to avoid friction. But what is the actual purpose of a tip?
Historically, tips sort of sprung up during the Great Depression as a way for restaurants to afford labor during a time in which they couldn't really afford to employ people at full wages. So, I mean, there's sort of an old expression that tip stands for to ensure prompt service. That's not really true, but it's sort of in the same way people make up like that news is supposed to be an acronym, even though it's the etymology of news has nothing to do with an acronym. But all of that to sort of say the original purpose was literally to fill in wages that otherwise couldn't be afforded during a tough economic time. And other countries adopted tipping and gratuities around the same time, but they then moved away from them as the Great Depression ended. The United States, quite uniquely in the world, didn't. So when you go to many other countries, there's either a service charge baked into the price already, or that is explicitly stated in the process. And in some countries, you don't tip. It's considered rude to tip because it's supposed to sort of suggest a classist sort of demeaning behavior to say, oh, I'm so much better than you that I'm just going to give you money for doing your job. In other countries, gratuities are somewhat expected or optional, but they're much smaller, right? 2%, 5%, 10%, as opposed to 15, 20, 25, 30 that you now sometimes see at various institutions. But we're also seeing tipping even creeping into sort of absurd areas, right? You hear anecdotes of people going through self-checkout systems at some stores, and the store says, "Do you want a tip?" And it's like, dude, I just bagged my own groceries. What do you mean, do I want a tip? So it's an interesting history. And again, this advent where we're starting to see much more aggressive tip pushing is largely just a byproduct of technology and kind of psychological research.
Interesting. So it originally started as a way to subsidize a portion of employees' income at service-based establishments, it sounds like. So that being said, do you still think the American consumer should be required to pay a portion of the employee salary via tips still?
I think that's a messy question because there's sort of an element of where are we. So I'll use Colorado as a really specific example. In the Colorado Constitution, there is a tip credit. The Constitution states that you cannot have a minimum wage for tipped workers that is any lower than, I think it's $3.07 or $3.08 than the normal state minimum wage. And at the time they passed that law back in like 2004, 2005, the difference between the minimum wage and that tip credit was essentially a 50% margin. So it was something like $7 minimum wage at the time, and you then couldn't pay tipped workers essentially less than about 50% of the minimum wage. But that tip credit does not change with inflation, so it's remained the same. So today in Colorado, a tipped worker can't be paid less than something like $11 and some odd cents per hour. And that's created an interesting conversation here in Longmont and in Boulder County, where there's now several proposals, and some have passed in certain municipalities and areas, to raise the minimum wage pretty aggressively. Boulder County is on a trajectory to raise it to about $28 an hour by 2035. Boulder's on a slightly more conservative trajectory, but is still going up there pretty quickly. And because that tip credit doesn't change, as that was being evaluated in Longmont over the past month, and city council held meetings and so on, we saw some people working in restaurants, right, or business owners, restaurants, coming up and saying, quite literally, today I've got people working front of house in the restaurant who are making $30, $40 an hour, right? Meaning that they're making, 20 plus, $30+ from gratuities on an hourly basis, and then still being paid an hourly rate of $11+ an hour on top of that. And so the interesting dynamic that sort of arises from that is, we have a pretty firm culture in the United States, right? If you can't afford to tip, you can't afford to eat out, right? If you go to a restaurant, you don't technically have to tip, but I mean, I'll just be the person who says it. You're an asshole if you don't. But by extension from that, we're starting to see gratuities again. Some places like restaurants come up and they have a little toast machine or a little square machine that you have to finger sign and select a tip, and they're starting off with default gratuities of 20, 25, 30% on the screen, and you've got to go out of your way to tip less if you want to, and a lot of people just won't. They'll just eat the extra gratuity, even if they wouldn't have tipped that much if it had just asked them what they wanted to tip in the first place. You also see it on receipts, but then you're now seeing it more in coffee shops. You're seeing it in many more service businesses. And there's certain industries where it's sort of interesting that gratuities exist. I always think of tattoo shops where you might be paying a tattoo artist, $100 an hour for their work, and they might be keeping, let's say, $80 of that $100 an hour as part of their employment. And then, you might pay them, let's say, $400 for a tattoo over several hours. And then, by the way, you're still expected to tip another 15, 20, 25% on top of that, even though you just paid them several $100s. So it's interesting how that's sort of expanded and how that's gotten out there. But to come back to your core question, should you tip? Yes, you should tip. But I do think it is completely fair for anybody to kind of directly push back against the manipulation, right? When somebody hands you a point of sale system or turns around the register and it's asking you to tip, 25% by default or 30 or 35, I think it's perfectly reasonable to click the custom tip thing and put in what you actually think is reasonable for what you've been provided, and to, introduce that friction and not be ashamed of it, because at the end of the day, it is just deliberately manipulating you for financial purposes. And so I think it's perfectly fair to say, I'm not going to let you do that to me.
Okay, and then this is more of a technical question. When you get a bill, let's say the pre-tax bill is $100 and after taxes is 110, for ease of example. Are you supposed to tip the percentage on the pre-tax or the post-tax figure?
The interesting thing here is that you'll get arguments about this. There's no rule technically. I would argue that you should be tipping based on the price of the things you purchased, and I think all the people being tipped would argue you should be tipping based on the gross amount. And that's, again, something where you can definitely argue it both ways. But I think that comes back to personal preference. And if somebody says, hey, you didn't tip me 15% of the gross, or of the sort of net of tax amount, you only tipped me on the gross amount, at that point we're starting to hem and haw over a difference of like several cents or $1 or something. And at that stage, I just think you walk away from that conversation, because again, it's technically not a requirement, it is a gratuity, and you are inclined to be as gracious and grateful as you want to be or not. And again, I do return to the point, if you don't tip, you're an asshole. But in that same sense, if somebody is really nitpicking you on whether you tipped on the tax as well or just tipped on the actual purchase price, just don't get into that conversation. Do whatever you want. It's up to you.
Yeah, I think that's just the financial planner in me. So, last question here. Let's say you're a strict 20%er or 15% or whatever the case may be. Do you typically change that percentage based on the level of service received, or do you typically still tip the same amount because that's what you've committed to?
Personally, this ends up being for me a decision really just around quality of service, but it's really just a question of how I'm going to round. If I think the service is normal, not even exceptional, but just normal, my general rule is going to be 15%, but just rounding up to the next $10. So if my thing is, let's say, $17, I'm going to tip $3, and if my thing is $25, I'm going to tip $4.50. I'm just going to do $1.50 per $10 and keep the math pretty simple there. But if I think the service is subpar, then you're going to see me do the math on exactly 15%. And again, I'm not going to short you. You were working for a living. Maybe the kitchen was slow. Maybe somebody didn't cover your shift appropriately. Maybe something was out of your control, whatever it is. So I'm not going to short you as my server or as the service provider in this particular case. But I'm not going to give you a penny extra than what is sort of socially and culturally commensurate with the norms.
Fair enough. Last topic here, Dan, and I know this is a hill that you would die on, and something you impress upon me, but also the team. It's observing, but also recognizing the price of something, but also the value you received for the price you're paying. Price is arbitrary, value is fundamental, and I think you'll recognize this name here. Some guy named Warren Buffett said, "Price is what you pay." Value is what you get. So I wanted to talk about it a little bit today, not only in the concept of investing, for retirement and finding quality investments, but also just this concept of paying for things that are, valuable, but maybe might be expensive. So let's just talk about it a little bit. Is it really something that we have to evaluate with all our purchases? Is the value received for the price we're paying?
No, not at all, actually. I'll use an example that I use to explain a particular economic theory, which is the economics of information. Very succinctly, the economics of information says we are going to price shop until we cease to benefit from continuing to price shop when we look for a good or service. So the example that I'll give about where we immediately cut that behavior off is you take your kids or your niece, your nephew, you take children to the county fair. And you know that everything at the fair is designed to extract as much money from you as possible, right? You want to throw darts at balloons, it's going to be $5. You want to throw balls at the little bottles on the shelf, it's going to be $5. Like, everything's going to cost money, and you just accept that going in. And that includes food, right? Everything's going to be overpriced. So when one of the kids says to you, "Hey, I'm thirsty," you look around for a water fountain, you don't see one. So you then go up to one of the little trailers that's selling, fries or hot dogs or whatever it is, and you say, "Hey, can I get a water?" And they tell you it's going to be $8. And you know that this little bottle of Aquafina they're offering you sells for like $3 for 36 in a pack at the grocery store. You are being ripped off to the tune of like $7.80 for this bottle of water, and you'll pay it. And you'll pay it because you don't think that if you wander around the fair, you're going to find cheaper water because the house always wins. Everybody's going to be selling it for the same amount. But also, B, it's not worth the time and energy. So in that particular sense, right, though I think value is very, very important for us to assess and contemplate when we think about the price of something, there's certainly an element where the price of something is just too low to be bothered with, right? Or the convenience or inconvenience of trying to find a better price really does creep up. This is where, as transactional value increases, you see more professional involvement, right? Realtors would not be a profession if houses were today selling for $5,000. right? They just wouldn't be. They couldn't make a living at their commission rates, or their commission rates would have to be something like 100%. And we would all do a comparison and be like, look, it's a $5,000 transaction. I'm not paying you an extra $5,000 to do it for me. But because homes sell for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, there's an entire profession built around helping people with this very complex and very expensive transaction, because the cost of errors or mistakes or failing to negotiate appropriately can be well in excess of the cost of the professional. So we engage the professional. There is something called client and consumer interaction theory, and essentially just posits that people will essentially make any bargain that they think nets them a value greater than their cost. So for every dollar you insert into the machine, as long as the value you receive back from the machine is equal to a dollar or greater than a dollar, you will engage in that transaction, as much as you possibly can. So as financial planners, we're in an interesting place where we are paid in the medium that we also provide value in, right? We are paid money to improve financial outcomes. And so that creates a very, very blunt economic analysis for some people. And there's large critics of financial planning who essentially just argue that the price never exceeds the value, or vice versa. But the fundamental truth of the matter is, right, value is highly subjective. You said it's objective, right? But it's highly subjective to the person receiving it. Somebody may not find it valuable for us to manage their portfolio. Somebody else might think it's the most valuable thing we do for them, even though the service is fundamentally the same between those two parties. But by extension from that, anytime we engage in a consumption decision, we are always making a price value assessment. It's just a question of whether we are going to spend a lot of time on due diligence and assessing that transaction, or whether the cost is so nominal as to remove the value of bothering to assess or do more due diligence and make a different decision potentially.
That's interesting, because there's certain things even I personally buy that I know are expensive. However, I know they're valuable relative to the price. So I don't calculate the ROI, or, I spend $1, I will receive $1. So one of the rules or things I personally try to live by is anything that touches the ground, I'm not going to cheap out on. So, my shoes, tires on my car, my golf clubs, they touch the ground a lot. And things like that, the practical things that will serve me long term. But I don't see the benefit or the ROI personally from buying a quality pair of shoes over a dumpy one that I'll have to repurchase the year after. So how do you weigh some of those purchases where you might not actually see the tangible value immediately in a numerical standpoint?
Well, I mean, let's just contemplate it in terms of the subjective value, right? So there's plenty of studies out there that show that while people are very inclined to overspend on assets, they tend to largely derive much greater kind of sort of psychological satisfaction and happiness from experiences. And it's interesting because those things overlap a little bit, right? When you buy your first $1,000 big flat screen 4K TV, you experience a great deal of joy. You put it up on the wall, you turn it on, the picture's crystal clear, you get to watch your first football game or whatever it is on it, and you're just like, wow, this thing is so awesome. And a month later, it's just your TV. And you no longer derive kind of direct emotional validation or enjoyment from it. It still can entertain you and provide value, but you don't ascribe the value to the TV. You ascribe it to the content you're consuming. In turn, right, people tend to cheap out on experiences. So a lot of people like to fly coach when they fly, or they look for the cheapest tickets on the cruise line or the cheapest hotel on their road trip, so on and so forth. And that might just be a reflection of their financial means. But back to sort of the underspending, overspending conversation earlier, for some people, it makes all the sense in the world to fly first class pretty much every time they fly, or it makes all the sense in the world to just go ahead and pay $300 for the room at the Marriott instead of $60 for the room at the Best Western, because for them, there's a quality of life element to them. This gets into a little bit of sort of like a Ramit Sethi, spend, cut ruthlessly on things you don't enjoy and spend, frivolously on things that you do. This is perfectly subjective to it, but I think everybody has to establish their own rules, right? Some people eat organic. There's not a lot of research on the quality of organic food versus real food in long-term health, but there are some people who swear by organic food, and there's some people who don't care. There's some people who will spend $1,000 on a set of golf clubs. There's some people for whom that would be a complete waste of money. The two people on this podcast being perfect examples of that. So, on some level, it's just a question of what do you value? What is valuable to you? And beyond that, don't overthink it. Now, there's a point where, again, we get into the underspending, overspending thing. If we're underspending, it's not so much of a problem. If we're overspending, now we do have to be a little bit conscientious of, hey, like you seem to think it's valuable, but you can't afford it. So at that point, how do we reconcile those kind of conflicts? But assuming that we're in a world of abundance and not scarcity, what's valuable to you is what's valuable to you. And as long as you're doing financially responsible things within your means, then enjoy whatever you enjoy and don't overthink it.
I think that's a perfect place to leave it, Dan.
Sure. Well, then by extension from that, we now, of course, must ask the question, Daniel, it's been a couple weeks since you've been on the podcast. What have you learned that you think our audience would need to know or benefit from hearing?
I think this is beneficial for the folks that are on the financial planning side of the audience, but also for the consuming side of the audience. It's that as a financial professional, Daniel Stefanski, not everybody I meet that I could provide value for will want to work with me. And that is completely fine. In fact, it's actually a good thing because I have a certain personality, a certain way of talking and a certain way of doing things that will resonate with a certain group of people considerably more than another group of people. And that means that the conversations and interactions I have with people like myself will be better, but it also means I'll enjoy working with that group of people better. And there are multiple other advisors who are skilled and competent, who have different personalities, who are better fits for other personalities and other types of people. And I think personally recognizing that and understanding that it's okay if not everybody wants to work with you has been a very beneficial learning experience for me.
I'll second that. And I'll also just point out for anybody listening, I will die on a hill that says every person in America could benefit from working with a financial planner. That doesn't mean you would benefit from working with every financial planner or any individual financial planner. There are plenty of times that people come into our office and they would benefit from working with us, but they are at a point in their financial journey where even though we could benefit them, it would be very close to break even with what we would charge them to work with us. And at that point, we're either going to work with them as a pro bono case, or we're going to refer them to another professional who has a lower cost, who can still provide a good deal of value for them. Or sometimes we're just going to give them kind of the blunt assessment. I'll give you a good example. Earlier this year, a couple came in and they had a number of financial goals and objectives. And one of the biggest issues facing them is they had tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt. And I could just tell from the initial consult, from the data gathering and the review, that the only advice I was going to be able to give them for the first 6 months of their engagement was going to be, you've got to get the credit card debt paid off. It's just too expensive. And so we made the decision in that conversation to look at these folks and say, hey, I'm going to tell you the piece of advice I'm going to give you. And it's the only thing I think you should do for the next 6 months is just pay off your credit cards. And if you go and do that, and then you want to work with us after you've done that, then that's a good basis for us to work together. But I don't think it makes sense for you to pay us hundreds of dollars a month to just tell you to do that for the next 6 months. So I'd rather see you do that and then come back and have a conversation with us when that's done. And that's hugely beneficial for them. And by not paying us hundreds of dollars a month, they were able to put that towards their credit cards. I think that same sort of balance exists in all cases. And I would challenge anybody who says, like, I know so much about finance that I never need to consult with a professional. There are financial planners for financial planners. There are financial planners who work with their own personal financial planners. And I promise, unless you do this for a living full time, I guarantee that anytime a professional financial planner looks at your case, you're going to find out that there's something you were missing. There's something you could have been doing better. There's something that could be more optimal. And that even 1 or 2 changes might make a difference to the tune of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars across your lifetime. So it's not to say that everybody needs to work with a financial planner their entire life, but for anybody who thinks that they've just got it on lock and they don't need any help, I promise you probably do. You just don't know it. And so in that sense, whether you want to talk to somebody today or talk to somebody later, listen to Daniel here when he says, hey, not everybody's going to be a fit for him. Not everybody's going to be a fit for me. But take the time to get help at least once and just figure out, hey, am I actually on the path that I think I am, or would I benefit from further help? The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.